Hi, I'm Tenzing Lun. Today we'll be reviewing what we learned about in Miss Gray's Unit 1A, a unit about European colonization and the American Revolution, a time period between 1606 and 1776. This was an era of adaptation and independence, referring to the American independence. We reviewed the colony of Jamestown, the Puritans, the adventures of Pilgrims, and all the other 13 colonies. Our heritage starts when the British decide they need new land and ends when the eagle flies.
In 1606, England's King James granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London to form a settlement in North America. The goal of the settlement was to find gold and a sea route to Asia. The triangle-shaped colony created would be known as Jamestown, the first successful English settlement. The people of Jamestown faced many difficulties. All right, follow me. The people of Jamestown faced many difficulties. Their winters were harsh and their crops were bare. Skirmishes with the natives were also damaging, and although their relationship with the Native Americans wasn't always good, their success that the colony found wouldn't have been possible without them. After all, the Native Americans provided the colonists with food, resources, and knowledge. And the colonizers settled on land that the Native Americans were once living on. In the end, Jamestown would be propelled to success when it found its cash crop, tobacco, and made immense amounts of money.
Let's move on to the next chapter, Pilgrims.
We've all heard of the story of the Pilgrims, but who were they really? The Pilgrims were a group seeking religious freedom from England. They were also known as separatists as they separated themselves from the Church of England. In 1620, a group of around 100, mainly pilgrims but also indentured servants and workers, boarded the Mayflower.
The Pilgrims would go on to found the Plymouth Colony, which is the first English colony in New England. The first winter was devastating for the Pilgrims, with over 50% of the Pilgrims dying. The remaining Pilgrims worked with the Native Americans in order to survive in the new territory. In 1921, the remaining Pilgrims would have a 3-day feast with the Native Americans, and this marks what we know as Thanksgiving.
On to our next topic, the Puritans. Who exactly were the Puritans? The Puritans were Christians who separated from the English church due to religious differences. They wanted to practice a purified version of Christianity. They wanted simpler religious services, and they wanted scriptures to be written in other languages and become more readily available. They viewed drinking and dancing as sinful activities. Because of their religious differences, they were persecuted by the English crown. Many went to the New World and they founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the year 1630. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was one of the first successful colonies in America, but despite being persecuted themselves, the Puritans persecuted other religious groups in New England.
When the colonists first settled, there were 13 original colonies. These colonies were Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. Each of these colonies had unique aspects, and they could be divided into one of 3 groups: New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. The biggest differences with these colonies laid in their geography, social, and economic aspects. The New England colonies were the most north and consisted of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, which was Massachusetts at the time. The geography of these colonies is generally rocky, soil, hilly, and mountains. Further inland, dense forests and rivers. The social life in these colonies was rather dull, with Puritans no religious freedom, and this was the coldest of all the colonies, with harsh winters. But there's less disease because of the coolness. Lastly, there was poor soil and a lack of farmland, which gave New England a mix of farming, fishing, and shipbuilding economies. 2, 1. Next, we have the Middle colonies. These colonies consisted of New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New York. The geography of these colonies was coastal plains, rolling hills, nutrient-rich soil. These colonies were also not dominated by any specific religion, which gave freedom to many religions. When it came to the economy, iron was a major resource. Rich soil gave a foundation for agriculture and livestock economy. Last but not least, the southern colonies: Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Maryland. The geography of these colonies was rolling hills and really good for farming, with warm weather. The southern colonies were also not dominated by any specific religion, which gave freedom to many religions. The southern colonies also had the most enslaved people of any region. The trade economy was dominated by slave plantations. Okay, that was a lot, but now you may see how when all these colonies work together, they can get some serious work done. Which brings me to the Revolution.
While Britain attempted to support their colonies, it didn't always feel that way. After Britain's 7-year war with France, they found themselves with severe debt. Knowing that it would take years to bounce back, they decided to turn to the colonists for help. This made sense to the British as they provided the colonists with new land that they could not even use and defend them in a battle that they never even want to be part of. Originally, they increased taxes on sugar, but had very little profit as merchants in the South were not affected at all. Then, to set up more efficient taxation, the British created the Stamp Act on March 22, 1765. Under the Stamp Act, all legal documents and public papers were taxed, such as newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards. Since these items were commonly used by all of the colonists, these taxes quickly grabbed everyone's attention, and they were outraged. Surprisingly, their issue with the policy wasn't that they had to cover Britain's debt, but that they were being given taxation without any proper representation. In fact, many of the colonists weren't worried about poor representation before the act because they hadn't been affected by abuses of power, such as the Proclamation of 1763 and the Sugar Act. However, being taxed seemed completely unfair when they didn't even have the right to represent themselves in government. The worst part was that these taxes they paid weren't even used to support their country, but for another one instead. And this idea is what helped many colonists realize that having no representation meant that they would have to put up with whatever the British government wanted them to.
So what happens next? Britain eventually revoked all of the taxes it had levied against the colonists, excluding the tea tax. The British was much more inclined to keep the tea tax because of its vast revenue that came from the approximate 1.2 million pounds of tea the colonists consumed annually. Colonists were extremely frustrated and angered by the tax, which led to boycotts and the selling of smuggled Dutch tea. At the same time, this decrease in sales for the British East India Company, which was the main British supplier of tea, caused millions of pounds of surplus tea to be left out and left them with the possibility of bankruptcy. More action in May of 1773 by the British Parliament led to the passing of the Tea Act. It allowed the British East India Company to sell tea duty-free and at a significant discount to the colonies compared to other tea businesses, although it continued to be subject to tax once arriving in colonial ports. The colonists were upset, and on December 16, 1773, dressed up as natives and tossed 90,000 pounds of tea into the ocean. Due to the taxation without representation, resentment in the colonies was at an absolute high. Colonists were upset about the high taxes that were being placed on them, such as the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and later the Townshend Act. To combat both the resentment and the colonists' tendency to reject taxes they believed were oppressive, Britain sent over 2,000 soldiers into the city of Boston. Their role was essentially to weed out anybody refusing taxation, which led to even more anger and eventually riots beginning to emerge in the city. This frequency of conflicts between colonists and soldiers, as well as between patriotic colonists and British loyalists, steadily increased, until on March 5, 1770, when 5 colonists were killed and the event was deemed the Boston Massacre. Colonist Paul Revere is remembered in this tragedy for his engraving of a now famous image showing British forces brutally killing American colonists. This artwork acted as anti-British propaganda that further fueled resentment in the colonies. It was deemed as one of the worst snowball events to ever take place during this time, and the colonists were able to repeal most of the acts, leaving just a tax on tea.
Unfortunately, the Boston Tea Party did not lead to instant liberation. In fact, the immediate response had quite the opposite effect. Britain was so furious with the singular event that they punished the colonists with a series of strict laws known as the Intolerable Acts. The first of the 5 was the Boston Port Act, which closed the Boston port and forced Boston citizens to pay a large fine, even the ones who weren't involved with the Tea Party. Then, the Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their home, which eventually led to the Third Amendment we have today. After that, the Massachusetts Government Act made Massachusetts a crown colony, or a colony in which the British monarch would appoint a new governor. Fourth, the Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials to leave their colony for any of their legal trials, essentially allowing them to escape prosecution. Lastly, the Quebec Act granted the Quebec province to the French Catholics inhabiting it and took it away from the colonists. While these acts focused on punishing citizens from Massachusetts, they were heard and felt throughout the colonies, and many finally decided to reform. To start the reform, the First Continental Congress was created in order to allow colonists to give feedback on various policies with one another. Not only did this Congress help come up with solutions to the oppressive rules inflicted by the British, but it also helped bring unity to all of the colonies, which would be useful in making their stand against Britain.
Let us take a look at the mystery document of the day. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh, how can you not know this? Obviously, the Declaration of Independence, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. Delegates from every colony met at the Continental Congress in Pennsylvania to write the document. The Declaration of Independence was essentially a document that signified the United States' independence from Great Britain. It also stated all the reasons why the U.S. was leaving and a general statement of natural human rights. The Declaration unified the 13 colonies by coming together and facing Great Britain as a whole. They also mentioned new requirements for their next government to make sure a tyranny never comes to power again.
Thank you for learning with us, and thank you, Ms. Gray, for being such a great teacher this year. Thank you!